dealing with guilt in pastoral care. A warm welcome to the participants of this webinar. For me, it is a privilege and special honor to contribute with my lecture to our common goal and give a greater impact on our topic so that we can see more sharply how to look for sources of hope for reconciliation. My presentation is not directly related to the South African social context, but still it relates perhaps indirectly. For I regard the family on which this lecture of mine is looking at as a spatial place where people can seek in the most original way what is fair to each other and where they can eliminate what stands in the way of that they are seeking for. I hold it as a place of locality where people live. Therefore, after being, this is the first structure that unfolds in life. This is a quoting from Rudy van Damme. And I hold it as a place where they are deeply embedded. Because of this, the family is the source of hope and opportunities for the society, contrary to the perception of Peter Weitzima, who called it in his book Entfremdung, alienation, the family as a victim of the alienating structures that define society, which itself becomes an alienating structure. In my experience, in particular, the wrong attitude towards the offenses committed prevents us from relaunching the seeking for what is fair to each other, to deny, trivialize, or dramatize the offenses, to avoid responsibility, or to pass it on the other or others. Such an attitude to sin is one of the which produce the most hopeless situation in pastoral care. In my talk, I will look for hope for such emerging situation, and I am going to seek the real resources for that hope. First, a short description of the nature of sin, of guilt. In looking for the sources of hope, I start by stating that it helps the pastor, the therapist, as much as the perpetrator and the victim, and they understand correctly and properly the essence of the sin and guilt. In what follows, where I will try to outline this, I am going to view guilt as an explicitly ethical category, tackling a sin. Meanwhile, I will count the theological category for it only implicitly. Anthropology, the fundamental relation nature of being. Sin is the sin of man, as a result, we can define it more precisely if we outline the essence of human existence. For that reason, I will start with anthropology and present its basic features based on Martin Buber's work I and O, then based on the theological anthropology and the philosophy of Emmanuel Levinas. I will also present the issue by flashing some relevant and representative thoughts. According to Buber, man's behavior is two-phased, as two are the basic words he can utter. One of the basic keywords is I-U for word pair. One can only say with this word being the basic word pair I-U. The concentration and fusion of myself into a whole being can never happen by me, and it can never happen without me. By you, I will become an I, a real me. And once I became I will be able to say you, All real life is real meeting. The creation story at the beginning of the Bible depicts the creating man as a pair of people. God created man as a man and woman, and they two together are the image of God. These two beings intimately belong together. This is expressed in the biblical Hebrew word ish and isha, in which the masculine and feminine form of the same word coincide with each other and form a word pair, sibuber. English displays this affiliation with the nouns man and woman, but other European languages tend to perceive distinctiveness, therefore perhaps different nouns are used. Another expression of togetherness, of belonging to each other, is the side rib motif. God formed the woman from the side rib of the man, and the so-called kinship formula, body from my body and bone from my bone. This togetherness, this belonging together, is characterized by the interdependence expressed especially in the biblical saying that it is not good for the man to be alone. For good means that it fulfills its purpose, and not could be alone means that males and females alone cannot fulfill their creation rendering and purpose on their own, and neither can live a full life. And the Swiss theologian Karl Barth put it this way in relation to the humanity of humankind. It is fundamentally wrong to attribute to man as an abstract being, that is to say, to attribute an abstract perception and notion of a human being. This only could happen when we view man as opposite to his fellow man, or only sees her fellow person as neutral, indifferent to her. But something similar happens even human coexistence is seen just as a subsequent, ancillary complement to human existence. Therefore, the theological anthropology cannot enter the field at all where a man without a fellow man could be considered a real possibility. And similarly, also pure humanity and the humanity to of each human being consists in its existence being determined by being together with the other human being in kirchliche dogmatic. The French philosopher Emmanuel Levinas describes relationality as multiple belonging, in which the other person or other person of the other person is also part of the belonging of the context. At the same time, the emphasizes that coexistence is a burden, a divine discomfort. In this, it consists the essence of man as subject. In the words of Meulenkorff and von Rijn, the word subject must be understood in the strictest sense of the word. Subjectus means subjected to a load or a burden. It is about the burden of taking responsibility for the other person's life, human existence of being for the other, for another. Man as a subject is not autonomous, but heteronomous. The other person is the source of my ethical attitude, sense of responsibility, and of my taking up the burden for responsibility. For the humanity of the other man is evocative and reminiscent of my humanity. The humanism of the other man is my humanism. The I is getting into contact with a being outside of itself, encounters something more than I that requires begs me to be fair. This pleading, which is also a call to action, pointing out my duty, creates and consolidates my freedom. Based on the above, we should consider that as one who can only exist in a multi-directional belonging according to his destination and purpose. This belonging togetherness means mutual interdependence, and interdependence in turn and in its own order provides the opportunity for the individual to unfold, became a responsible subject by addressing the other, and the relationship of mutual care, a real encounter, came into being and is established. The image of man does not harmonize with the social philosophy of our time and the philosophy of life of individuals. Modernism, which extends into postmodernism, promotes the individual and individualism. We can contrast this view with the fact that the chance to awaken a sense of relational responsibility lies in another person, and that we can gain individual significance only by taking on the burden of the other one's existence and the merits thus gains. At the backdrop of the autonomies proclaimed by the postmodern and the consequent gradual loneliness, we can contrast the existence of the fabric, a living network of connections that holds, turns on, and embeds. Not with polemics, but with that kind of humble conviction that relational existence is more original than isolated form of existence. This core belief is the foundation on which family therapy and pastoral care of family draws hope. Second, guilt endangering relational existence. If man's existence depends on ethical belonging, then guilt and any sin are directed against belonging and thus basically against the actual existence. Guilt threatens existence. Below, I flash some basic thoughts on existential guilt by Martin Buber, Ivan Bösömenyi-Nagy, and Barbara Krasner, Aad van Rijn and Hanneke Meulen-Korf, and Barbara Krasner and Austin Joyce. Existential guilt in the writing of Martin Buber. Martin Buber deals mainly with the issue of existential guilt and guilt feelings and what is common to all. There is a close connection between these two treatises. The first deals with the positive, active aspect of existential guilt, and the second with its negative, passive aspect. Existential guilt as a concrete and actual event. Buber, in his treatise Guilt and Guilt Feelings, speaks of the concreteness of the patient and understand, on the one hand, the event of the life of the suffering persons burned with guilt, and on the other hand, the relationship of the patient with the person with whom he stands in a strongly life-determining relationship. The term offense-laden events indicates the tangible existence and offenses. This is the first meaning of the existential signifier. On the other hand, it is clear from the above quote that the existential signifier refers to both the personal reality and the whole existence of man. Buber speaks with one breath about how man becomes who he is and about making a real connection with the human world. Man's becoming to be himself and his active participation in that form a single unit in the relationship between him and the human world. We can merely accept or neglect, and we violate the actor relationship. Violation of the relationship means that the human order of being is in that place has been violated. The third feature of existential guilt is the ontic aspect. In the penultimate paragraph of his study, Buber, in view of the novel of Kafka, The Trial, talks about the ontic nature of guilt, the depths of existential guilt. He talks about the guilt that permeates and interweaves existence. Existential guilt as an indifferent withdrawal from the world. Although the essay, What is Common to All, is more philosophical in nature, nevertheless, it contains a serious ethical message. According to Buber, Heraclitus of Ephesus makes vigilant coexistence our duty and responsibility. He rejects the dreamlike denial of we. Based on the teaching of the Tao and the most ancient Upanishads, as well as the writing of Aldous Huxley, he speaks of man retreating and withdrawing into situationless, which he interprets as the escape of a person from the existential requirement imposed on him, which has to be realized instead in the us. It is an escape from the human talk as authentic talk nature of his speech, in whose realm an answer is demanded, and an answer means responsibility. So man is fundamentally indebted to the communal, and withdrawing from the us is nothing more than an escape from responsibility, or an escape from response, meaning responsibility, a runaway from the existential requirement demanded from a person. The what is common to all can be interpreted as an expression of man's indebtedness, debitum, and the essay, guilt and guilt feeling, as an expression of man's concrete and actual indebtedness, culpa. Man's indebted state precedes its process of actor becoming indebted. This approach is expressed in the contextual approach Beszéményi Nagy Iván, in that is favors asymmetric relationships with respect to existential guilt. Existential guilt in contextual approach and therapy. First by Beszéményi Nagy Iván and Barbara Krasner. Beszéményi Nagy and Krasner referred to Buber in their book Between Give and Take about existential guilt as follows. Existential guilt must be distinguished from guilt springing from the superego. Existential guilt is rooted in the fact that one actually violates the justice of the human order, and therefore demands restoration between the parties. The existential guilt is at the same time a source of repentance to which the perpetrator owes. The above phrasing refers to the nature of the sin as a wrong deed, and interprets the existential guilt as actor sin, the most appropriate indication of which is the concept of culpa derived from Roman law. The existing sin is to be found primarily in the first dimension from the four dimensions of the reality of being, and should be thought in the dimension of facts. To put it in a different way, this can be found mainly in asymmetric relationships in the field of retaliatory injustice caused by humans. The nature of the act of offense committed is tangibleness, and it's publicly allow us to catch out in action, as opposite to the inner guilt, including real guilt, which is difficult to access. When transgressions are made public, the way is opened for individual freedom and dialogue. Existential guilt as a debit, or debitum in Latin. Beszéményi Nagy and Krasner talk about the natural existential debt of offspring to parents in relation to intergenerational consequences and expectations. Debt is placed in intergenerational relationships and is perceived as a debitum. The interdebtedness of the offspring comes from the benefits received, and it manifested in adequate repayment to the parents as well as responsible care for the next generation. Debt repayment is done forward rather than backward. Existential guilt in the interpretation of Van Rijn and Meulenkorff. Van Rijn and Meulenkorff talk about existential guilt mainly in their book The Context and the Under, and believe that the relation to existential guilt one must first think of what is at stake between parents and children, and thereby placing asymmetry in the real, genuine dialogue as well. There is clear consistency with the interpretation of Bessemer, Nadia, and Krasner, who express the primacy of asymmetric relationship with the notion of natural existential debt, and by pointing out the risk that this debt poses to offspring. Another important insight of the authors is that in Bessemer thinking, the emphasis is not on the factuality of debt, which is the opposite of guilt, but on the factuality of the consequences for the other person, which result from the violation of the order of being. This is an important addition to the concept of Buber on existential guilt, which primarily refers to the specific act. Existential guilt in the interpretation of Krasner and Joyce. Krasner and Joyce in their book Truth, Trust and Relationship are using the term interpersonal existential guilt. And that is because sin and guilt are placed in the context of relation justice when they talk about it. The authors believe that sin and guilt are byproducts of the central dilemma of when to give and when to accept, when we need to do something for ourselves and when we need to act for others. The author pair makes a distinction between the inventive and the pathological side of guilt. The former moves on to settle one's relationship, while the other isolates, separates people, and forces them despite their intention to violate their commitment to a genuinely lived life. According to authors, the offenses arises when we are unable to respond to the legitimate demands and addressed of the world. True guilt has to do with the isolated, monologous position of which we consider ourselves the only point of reference, or by which we completely give up on ourselves as a valid point of reference. These wordings are strongly reminiscent in how Buber wrote about individualism in What is Common to All. They can be seen as relation applications of Buber philosophical statements. What happens in the larger cosmic dimension is found to a lesser extent in asymmetrical relationship. Krasner and Joyce views on guilt are also relevant to existential guilt. According to them, people use guilt to replace the ethical obligation within. Living in a spirit of gathering guilt always hides the path to responsible behavior in response. Guilt banishment to the limit of his own psyche and deprives him to the freedom to grow for a new trust. Moreover, one person's guilt narrows the other man's space to live a differentiated life. What's more, paradoxic ways, people often use guilt to not have to really accept that they have sinned. theological consideration related to the concept of guilt. In the Bible, several notions denote sin or transgression. Here, the biblical Hebrew notion of chata is relevant, the basic meaning of which is to mislead the goal. In the New Testament, the original profane meaning of the Greek verb for parabino is deviant, to deviate, to diverge from the original and actual direction. These two verbs do not refer to a specific guilt, but to an action different from the order of existence and thus detrimental to relationships. This is supported by the fact that in addition to the verb chata, we often find the expression what he should not have done in book Leviticus. The term presupposes an existing and valid order of law and life, and the word chata denotes such a transgression which goes against the word and the order of human existence and violates the sacredness indicated by spheres and jurisdictions. The state created by guilt is denoted by the noun chata'at in Hebrew, which indicates a near-death state. Because it represents the injury and disturbance of the world order and the way of life, disturbing it causes chaos and the disorderly turmoil and dangerous life. As ethical category, the biblical concept of guilty act does not primarily look for at the specific act of sin, but at its consequences for the other person which severely limit or even endanger the other person's existence. Thus, this concept is very close to the concept of existential guilt known from the contextual point of view or from the concept of Buber of human guilt. It emphasizes the actual consequences of guilt and takes into account the whole of human existence and the human world. 3. The benefits of the notion of existential guilt in pastoral care and family therapy. As I mentioned, in pastoral care, we often encounter denial of guilt, which is backed by complex intrapsychic and relational dynamics, shame, loyalty. The existential nature of sin and the concept of existential guilt can be an important source of help for both the context and the counselor of therapists. The first benefit, the factual nature of the offense encourages us to linger responsibly at the first dimension and to carefully examine what wrongdoing has taken place. The transgression expressed and interpreted herein may free someone to admit that. Second, the specific nature of existential guilt to draw attention to the consequences of an act or omission as an injustice of debt can trigger in the perpetrator the sense of admitting and can encourage contrition to face it and honestly admit it. Thus, existential guilt can be at the same time the source of the repentance to which the perpetrator owns, or Krasner and Joyce put it, the awareness and sin consciousness transforms into a resource and encourage people to settle relationships. At the same time, the factuality of the consequences may encourage the offender to start looking for the possibility of remedy and for specific reparation and amends. Third, Existential guilt, such as the violation of the order of existence, may make it clear that the family context is part of the larger community and that damage trust in the family also mean damage in the reliability of the cosmos of humanity. The responsibility of the human world for the we also reinforces the social responsibility and role of the family. As a place of trust, it can contribute to the healing of the human world. How much this is needed is clear from Zima's description cited above. Contextual therapy, by paying close attention to asymmetric relationship and caring for future generations, can effectively help prevent the family from becoming an alienating structure. And finally, the relational anthropology behind existential guilt suggests that the ultimate goal of pastoral care and family therapy is reconciliation, that is, initiating and restoring dialogue within the context. And forgiveness and exoneration are the goals before the ultimate one. Thank you for your attention.